The winter of 1942 did not simply arrive in Auschwitz, it colonized it. It pressed itself into the mortar of the walls, into the breaths of the prisoners, into the smell of the barracks, into the snow that refused to fall white, and instead descended in flakes stained grey by the smoke that belched from the chimneys day and night. There was no sky, not truly, only a permanent haze that blurred the horizon into a shapeless smear of ash and frozen air. The ground crunched underfoot with ice, bone fragments and the brittle remnants of things no one would name, and the wind carried sounds that were not quite screams and not quite silence, but something in between, a kind of muffled echo of despair that seemed to vibrate beneath the snow itself. It was a season not of cold, but of suffocation, where even breathing felt like trespassing against something vast and ancient and merciless. The world outside the fences continued to turn, war strategies shifted, front lines moved, but inside Auschwitz time did not pass, it calcified. In the center of this machinery of death stood the Kommandantur House, a building that existed like a wound that refused to close. Warm yellow light glowed from its windows. Smoke from a cedar-burning fireplace rose in a soft plume that differed from the other smoke, the smoke of bodies, of testimonies erased, of existence undone. Inside, rugs warmed the floors. A gramophone sat near a polished cabinet, and the smell of roasted bread traveled through hallways lined with portraits framed in gold. The building was not simply a home. It was a statement, a demonstration that comfort could coexist with horror, that cruelty could wear the shape of domesticity, that a family could dine within earshot of death and feel nothing. Every clock in that house ticked softly, precisely, insistently, as if marking the heartbeat of a world that had decided suffering was merely another kind of order. It was in this house that SS Obersturmführer Heinrich Falken lived, a man built from angles and rules, whose existence seemed to be carved rather than born. His uniform was always immaculate, his boots polished to such a shine they reflected the faces of those forced to kneel before him. His jaw was rigid, his gaze measured, his silence heavier than any command he issued. Those who served under him did not fear his anger, they feared his control, the terrifying predictability of a man who believed cruelty was not an act of violence, but a form of management. He was a father, which made him frightening in a different way, not because fatherhood humanized him, but because it revealed what he valued, what he would protect, what he would destroy if threatened. His daughter, Lissel Falken, had been born into this landscape of unspoken terrors. 16 years old, pale as the frost on the barracks' roofs, she carried a kind of quietness that was not innocence, but awareness without language. Her golden hair, disciplined into a braided rope down her back, contrasted with the gradual fading light in her eyes, a light that had dimmed in the years after her mother's death. She did not ask questions about the camp. She did not comment on the smoke. She did not flinch at the sound of distant gunshots. Children raised among ghosts learn early what adults would rather not explain, and yet there was something still unbroken in her, a thin filament of gentleness that had not yet snapped. Then, one evening, that filament was tested. The fever struck without warning, rising in her like a fire set in a locked room. Her skin flushed red, then burned. Her breath became shallow and frantic. Her pulse thundered against her ribs like a trapped animal. The household staff attempted remedies, cold cloths, herbal infusions, whispered prayers, but nothing brought relief. The German physicians stationed at the camp examined her with professional detachment, exchanged clinical jargon, and stepped back with the same fear they pretended they did not feel. The illness did not match the ordinary patterns of infection. It was sudden, violent, consuming. Falken's face did not change, not in front of the officers, not as he dismissed the medical men with a clipped gesture. But the stillness in him altered, subtly, dangerously, like a crack forming in the foundation of a dam. The servants felt it, the guards sensed it. The air seemed to tighten as though the house understood that something sacred to its master had been placed at the edge of a cliff. And then someone, no one would later admit who, murmured the forbidden suggestion, "There is a prisoner, a doctor, a Jewish surgeon, Vienna before the war. They say he is skilled." The room froze. To bring a Jew into the commandant's home, to place the life of a German child in his hands, was not merely unorthodox, it was blasphemy under the ideology that governed the camp. But ideology was a luxury compared to fear of loss. And Falcon was a man who would not, allow death to take something from him when he could command otherwise. The order was issued before anyone could fully comprehend the consequences. Bring the prisoner, the doctor, immediately. And so, under the glare of searchlights and the bite of winter wind, guards descended into the prisoner barracks and dragged forth a man half-starved, half-shadow, Dr. Samuel Weiss, once a celebrated surgeon, once a father, once a man, now a number in striped cloth. He was marched across snow that swallowed his steps, toward the house where warmth glowed like a lie, toward the moment when the past and the present would collide in a way no one inside Auschwitz was prepared to witness. And the camp watched, and the smoke rose, and something that had been frozen in place for months began to move. They brought Dr. Samuel Weiss to the Kommandantur house under the cold glare of floodlights, the snow around him crushed into a thin gray paste by boots that marched without hesitation or thought. He did not resist, not because he had surrendered his will, but because resistance in Auschwitz did not mean defiance. It meant shortening the already narrow path on which a man's life balanced. He walked with the posture of someone carved down to the smallest version of himself, as though the air around him had become too heavy to carry a body larger than a shadow. His striped uniform hung from his frame like wet cloth, his ribs visible through fabric, his hands raw and cracked from labor, yet his movements retained the faint echo of a man who once commanded rooms filled with light, instruments, polished floors, and the quiet reverence of those who entered seeking salvation. But the camp had taken that man and ground him beneath its architecture of humiliation, leaving only a remnant that endured not through hope, but through the slow, practiced art of survival without identity. The warmth inside the house struck him like a blow. It was too soft, too scented with cedar and clean soap and bread rising in the oven. The contrast between inside and outside was an accusation, a reminder that cruelty did not need to be loud. It could be upholstered, perfumed, framed in gold. The guards hesitated at the threshold, not because they feared the doctor, but because stepping into that house required acknowledging that there were two worlds inside the camp, one where men lived and one where men were kept alive. Weiss was led past the foyer, past carpets imported from Vienna, perhaps from a home not unlike the one he once owned, and up the staircase where each wooden step creaked not from age, but from memory. The upper hallway smelled faintly of lavender oil, a scent associated in his mind with hospital rooms where children still had futures. But now, here, the fragrance clung to something that was slipping out of the world. Liesl lay in her bed, her skin glowing with fever, her breath shallow, her eyes half open but unfocused, as though she were caught in a dream she could neither wake from nor sink fully into. Weiss approached her, not as a doctor summoned to perform his duty, but as a man stepping into the presence of something fragile, something that required him to remember who he had once been. He examined her with gentle movements that contrasted violently with the brutality outside the walls of that room. His fingers hovered before they touched, not out of hesitation but out of a kind of reverence born from the understanding that the body beneath his hand was not simply sick, it was frightened. He checked her pulse, her breathing patterns, the tension in her muscles, the dryness of her lips, and he recognized the signs of a fever that threatened to ignite into delirium if left unchecked. The German doctors had failed, not because they lacked knowledge, but because they treated bodies, not people. Weiss had always treated the person first. Commander Falcon stood behind him, silent, rigid, watching not the patient, not the procedure, but the process, as though trying to understand how a man who was supposed to be broken could still move with purpose. For Weiss did not tremble, he did not hurry, he did not plead, he worked. And in that work flickered a glimmer of something that the camp had not been able to kill: agency. Falcon recognized it instantly. Power recognizes power, even when it is buried under starvation and ash. He did not speak, but his silence was not detachment. It was attention sharpened to a blade. Days passed in a rhythm that felt unnatural within Auschwitz, where routines were built to destroy rather than heal. Weiss was escorted daily from barracks to house, from cold to warmth, from death to the edge of life. He adjusted medications, applied cool cloths, massaged stiff hands, whispered words meant to tether Liselle to consciousness rather than allow her to drift into the fever's dark corridor. And slowly, not suddenly, not dramatically, she began to return. Her breathing deepened, her pulse steadied, her eyes opened and focused, first on the ceiling, then on the window, then on him. Their first real moment of awareness came at dawn. Weiss was changing the cloth on her forehead. Liselle opened her eyes fully, saw his face and did not recoil. Her voice, dry and cracked, came in a whisper barely audible. "You are not afraid." It was not a question. It was an observation, born of a mind that had witnessed fear all its life and now recognized its absence. Weiss did not respond because any answer would have required acknowledging truths they both already knew, that fear belonged to life, and both of them were living at the very edges of it. Liselle's gaze lingered on him, searching not for identity. She knew who he was, what he was, but for why he still existed the way he did. The soft, human presence of him in that room felt like an offense against the world outside its walls. This was the disturbance that began to spread, not through words but through shifts in atmosphere. The guards escorting Weiss began to walk beside him instead of behind. The maid who brought linens began setting aside an extra scrap of bread without being told. Liselle began asking small questions in quiet tones that carried the weight of a child who had lived her entire life under things never spoken. But the disturbance spread beyond the house. Auschwitz is a place where nothing can change without being noticed. Rumors did not appear as sentences. They appeared as glances held too long, silence when there should have been laughter, footsteps in hallways slowing instead of passing briskly. And from these fragments of observation, meaning formed. A Jewish prisoner was treating the commandant's daughter. The commandant allowed it. The prisoner walked differently now. The girl looked at him when she spoke. The commandant watched the prisoner not with disdain, but with need. And where rumors gather, power shifts. Where power shifts, predators wake. In Block 10, behind sterilized walls and surgical steel trays, Dr. Reinhard Kruger watched the disturbance take shape with a calm hunger. He had seen the commandant soften. He had seen the prisoner regain something that should have been dead. He knew what it meant. A bond had formed, a forbidden one, a dangerous one. And Auschwitz was not a place where bonds were allowed to live. The day the horror revealed itself did not announce its arrival with sirens, shouts, or spectacle. It came instead wrapped in the quiet efficiency of routine, in the same rhythm of boots on gravel, in the same cold wind rolling through the camp like a memory of winter that refused to leave. But something in the air was different, an almost imperceptible tightening, as though the very atmosphere had begun holding its breath. The guards walked with a touch more alertness. The dogs sniffed the air with restless urgency. The prisoners sensed a shift in the invisible current of dread that governed their days. And in Block 10, the medical ward where the line between science and cruelty dissolved into one uninterrupted shape, Dr. Reinhard Kruger waited, his white coat crisp and immaculate, his hands gloved, his expression composed with a serenity that did not belong to medicine but to predation. He had been patient. He had watched the boundary between prisoner and commander erode grain by grain, gesture by gesture, silence by silence. And now the structure that had held the world in place was soft enough to break. They did not drag Weiss violently. They did not beat him. They did not need to. Violence is a crude tool, and Kruger was a man who preferred sculpting minds rather than bodies, at least at first. The guard who came for Weiss spoke with the mechanical neutrality of someone delivering a schedule change. The walk to Block 10 was the same path Weiss had traveled dozens of times to reach the Kommandantur house, except now the direction was reversed, not toward warmth but toward the coldest place within the camp. A cold not of temperature but of intention. Snow crunched beneath their boots, the breath of the guard forming white clouds in the air, while Weiss's breath came out faint and thin, as though his lungs had been coated with dust. The chimneys smoked, the sky sagged low. The world moved on, unaware that a man was being lowered into a chamber of silence where something irreversible would take place. Block 10 was clean. That was what made it unbearable. The floors were scrubbed daily. The instruments gleamed beneath electric light. The walls were white, too white, the kind of white that erases detail rather than reveals it. The room smelled not of rot, but of disinfectant and metal, sterile agony. Pain that had been organized. This was the horror of the modern world. Suffering industrialized, sanitized, made efficient. Kruger stood beside a table lined with instruments arranged in exact order: scalpel, bone clamp, probe, syringe, needle, cotton, basin, everything aligned as though this were an operating theater of healing rather than experimentation. He greeted Weiss with a polite nod, the same nod one physician might give another before beginning a complex procedure. There was no mockery, no gloating. That was what made him monstrous. His cruelty was clinical, untouched by emotion. He gestured toward the far corner. There stood a child, a boy no older than 7, bones visible beneath skin, eyes sunken yet wide with that raw, desperate clarity children possess when they have seen too much but cannot yet understand any of it. His head was shaved. His hands trembled. His breath came quickly, like a bird trapped inside a cage too small to spread its wings. He looked at Weiss not with recognition, but with the primal plea that every child makes when in the presence of an adult. Save me. It was not a request. It was an instinct older than language. Kruger did not explain. He did not need to. The meaning of the test was clear. A surgeon must perform surgery. A doctor must treat the living. A man must decide what kind of man he is when the world has stripped away every excuse. He placed the scalpel in Weiss's hand, not forcing, not pressing, simply laying it there with the care of someone passing a violin into the hands of a musician. The metal was cold, too cold. The shock of it traveled up Weiss's arm and seemed to settle somewhere beneath his ribs, where grief had once been but had long since hardened into something that resembled stone. His fingers curled around the instrument, not because he chose to hold it, but because muscle memory is the last part of a person to die. His hand remembered being steady. His hand remembered healing. His hand remembered his son. That was the cruelty. Kruger understood memory. Weiss's vision blurred for a moment, not from tears, but from the sudden collapse of every barrier he had built to survive. The boy's eyes, wide and shimmering with terror, flickered in his mind and overlapped with another face, another child, a memory he had shoved deep into the space between waking and sleep. He saw his son standing on a sunlit balcony in Vienna, holding a wooden horse, smiling with the unshattered confidence of a life that still believed the world was whole. He saw the train platform. He saw the separation. He saw the doors close. He saw no more after that. His hand moved, not because he chose, because the alternative was to acknowledge that there was no world left in which choice existed. The operation was slow, too slow, cruel by necessity, not incompetence. Kruger wanted to see him break, not the boy. The child whimpered, gasped, shuddered, but did not scream. Suffering had already taught him silence. Weiss heard nothing, not the metallic sound of the instruments, not the faint breathing of the guards, not the low hum of the electric lights. The room had collapsed into a tunnel of motion. Blade, tissue, thread, pressure, tremor. His body worked. His soul watched. When it was done, the scalpel fell from his hand, not dropped, but released, as though the object weighed far more than steel should. There was no triumph in Kruger's expression, only satisfaction, the kind of satisfaction a scientist feels when a hypothesis is proven correct. He leaned forward slightly, speaking only 3 words. "Now you understand." And Weiss did. Not the ideology, not the cruelty, but the truth. Auschwitz was not designed to kill the body. It was designed to kill the part of a person that believes they are human. He walked back to the Kommandantur house that evening, like a corpse returning to the place it had once lived. His steps were steady, his face was calm, nothing about him looked broken, which was how everyone knew that he had been. Liesel saw it first when he entered her room. She reached for his hand. He did not move away, but he did not move toward her either. There was no connection now, only absence. The disturbance was no longer subtle. It had become the fracture before collapse. The camp did not change outwardly after the event in Block 10. The chimneys still exhaled their heavy grey breath into the sky. Dogs still paced with tongues steaming in the cold. Guards still shouted orders that echoed across the frozen yard like reminders that life here did not belong to those who lived it. The trains continued to arrive in the early morning, the hiss of brakes and the metallic groan of iron wheels dissolving into the same sound that served as the background hum of death. Nothing in the physical world shifted, but something intangible did, something so subtle that it was not perceived by those who understood Auschwitz only in terms of systems and procedures. It was sensed first in the air, in the way silence began to stretch longer between spoken words, in the way footsteps became softer not by design, but because it felt wrong to make noise now. Something had been broken, not in the camp, but inside a man. And when a man breaks in a place designed to annihilate humanity, the break echoes like a quiet collapse of a structure that had been holding back a flood. Weiss returned to the Kommandantur house each day with the same steady gait, the same careful hands, the same controlled movements, but he was no longer the same man who had first stepped inside its walls. The change was not visible, because the camp had already erased all signs of individuality long ago, but there was something deeper, something in the way he no longer paused before touching Liesel's wrist to measure her pulse, something in the way his eyes did not focus on the world directly, but rather seemed to be watching from behind a pane of invisible glass. The silence inside him now was not restraint, but absence. It was as if a room that had once contained something fragile, hope, memory, the last thread of identity, had been emptied completely, leaving only space. He spoke only when necessary. He moved only when required. He breathed because the body continues, even when the soul has stopped. Liesel felt the change instantly, not because she understood its cause, but because pain recognizes itself in others. She watched him in the quiet hours of the morning, when the frost on the window panes refracted the light into cold shards of milky blue. She saw the way his face did not shift when he concentrated, the way there was no softness in how he arranged her blankets, the way his gaze no longer ever drifted to the window, as though remembering something beyond the camp walls. Before, even in suffering, he had seemed connected to a world outside this one, a world full of memory and loss and longing. But now he was fully inside Auschwitz, not as a prisoner of its fences, but as a prisoner of its psychological architecture. The camp had finally reached him, not with starvation, not with labor, but with choice. Commander Falken sensed the shift as well, though he did not have the language to understand it. He watched Weiss move through the house with a quiet that was no longer fear and no longer submission, and it unsettled him in a way that gnawed at the edges of his composure. Falken was a man accustomed to control, but control requires reaction. One must be able to produce fear, obedience, anger, gratitude, something. Weiss now offered nothing. He existed in Falken's presence the way stone exists in a riverbed, shaped only by forces no human hand could command. It was the first time in his life that Falken confronted a presence that could not be manipulated, not because it resisted, but because it no longer cared. He tried quietly to reclaim that dynamic. A question asked at night, a comment about war strategy, a remark about Vienna testing whether memory could be stirred. But Weiss did not respond with memory. He responded only with silence. A silence so vast and heavy it seemed to suck the air out of the corridor. Falken would speak and Weiss would listen, and in that listening there was no acknowledgement, only the echo of a man who had already left the world of the living. That silence changed Falken. It made him uneasy. It made him smoke more. It made him walk the halls of his house at night with the heavy tread of a man who fears a truth he cannot articulate. The war outside was no longer the war that mattered. The war was now inside his home. But the camp noticed too. It noticed without needing to say anything. Guards glanced longer. Servants stopped humming as they worked. The air inside the house no longer held warmth. It held something that resembled the tension of an orchestra, about to snap its bowstrings. And at the center of all this was Dr. Reinhard Kruger, who watched everything with the patience of a man who knew that collapse is more effective when allowed to unfold slowly. He spoke politely when he visited the house, offering updates on Berlin's scrutiny, casually mentioning the need for renewed medical documentation, always with the precise tone of someone who does not accuse but simply illuminates consequences. His eyes, however, said what his voice did not. I saw what you did. I know what he is now, and I know what you are losing. The letter from Berlin arrived in silence, sealed, official. No explanation provided, because no explanation was necessary. It contained the transfer order for Liesl Falken for continued recovery in a controlled environment. The language of bureaucracy is always clean when used to erase what is inconvenient. Falken read it with a stillness that was not shock, but realization. The machine he served had assessed him, calculated risk, and acted. It had decided that his daughter was now a liability to the image of command, and liabilities are removed quietly, without ceremony. She left before dawn the next day, escorted by 2 officers who spoke softly and did not meet the commander's eyes. She did not cry. She did not plead. She only looked at Weiss once, not for rescue, not for explanation, but in acknowledgement of the fact that something had existed, briefly, impossibly, in a place where nothing human was meant to survive. Then she was gone. The snow fell. The door closed. No word was spoken in the house for the rest of the day. Weiss walked back to the barracks with steps that left almost no imprint in the snow, as though his body weighed nothing at all. Falken stood at his window until nightfall, staring at a yard that had never looked empty before. And Kruger waited, the way a man waits for a flame to burn through the last sheet of paper in a sealed box. Because now there were no more witnesses to protect, no more reasons to restrain anything, no more fragile threads holding back the inevitable. The camp had achieved what it was designed to do. Everything inside was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before destruction. In the days that followed Liesl's departure, Auschwitz seemed to sink into a deeper stillness, as if the camp itself had been holding onto a thin thread of something human without realizing it, and now that thread had finally snapped. The sky remained the same endless blur of grey smoke and winter haze. The chimneys continued their unbroken exhale of particles that were once people. The frozen ground continued to crack beneath marching boots, but there was an absence hanging over the compound that was palpable, not the absence of sound or motion, but the absence of something that had once existed quietly and without permission. A fragile, forbidden presence that had briefly interrupted the machinery of annihilation. Connection. Now that connection had been removed with the same efficiency with which records were filed, transports were scheduled, and lives were erased. The air felt thinner, colder, as if the world itself had exhaled and decided not to inhale again. Dr. Samuel Weiss returned each day to the manual labor to which he had originally been assigned. His hands, once instruments of precision and healing, now gripped rough wood and rust-eaten iron. He shoveled snow, carried crates, scrubbed floors, tasks designed not to accomplish work, but to break the body slowly. The guards no longer looked at him with curiosity or unease. The disturbance had passed. To them he was again what he had always been, a number, a shape, a moving object among thousands of others moving under compulsion. But something had changed in the way Weiss carried himself. His movements remained controlled, efficient, deliberate, but now they were hollow, as if performed by a body that no longer remembered its purpose. He did not think of Liesl. He did not think of his son. He did not think of the boy in Block 10. He did not think. And that was the final victory of Auschwitz, not the breaking of flesh, not the extinguishing of breath, but the erasure of memory's weight. Commander Falken continued to perform his duties with the same rigid discipline as before. He attended staff meetings, issued orders, inspected the barracks, signed transport manifests, listened to reports, all with the composure of a man who understood his role precisely. But those who served under him noticed subtle fissures forming in his demeanor. His cigarettes burned down to the filter without being smoked. His boots, once polished to a mirror sheen, now bore flecks of dried snow and soot. His voice, once sharp and exact, now lowered into a softer register, as if every word required effort. He spent more time standing near the window of his office, staring out at the blank expanse of snow that stretched beyond the barbed wire, as though searching for something he could not name. Not redemption. Redemption was impossible in a place like this. Not regret. Regret was a luxury for those whose actions were not already carved into history, but something quieter. Something like the shape of a life he had already lost, long before he realized it was gone. Dr. Reinhard Kruger did not change. If anything, he became more composed, more precise. The disturbance had been removed. The camp had returned to its equilibrium, its terrible mechanical rhythm. He resumed his experiments with renewed clarity, adjusting protocols, developing new procedures, requesting new shipments of medical equipment. His notes were detailed, elegant, orderly. His handwriting was beautiful, and that was its own kind of horror. That the man who orchestrated the destruction of identity, of self, of memory, believed himself to be a mere administrator of scientific truth. He would later burn his notes, not out of guilt, but because the Reich, like all machines of death, demanded silence after obedience. Time passed in Auschwitz the way rot spreads, quietly, gradually, invisibly, until nothing recognizable remained. And yet, the story did not end there. Because stories like this do not end with death or silence or disappearance. They end in the echo that follows, in the empty space left behind, in the questions that cannot be asked because there is no longer anyone who remembers the answers. It happened in late spring, though spring in Auschwitz was not a season of rebirth. The snow melted into a thick grey slurry. The air grew heavy with moisture that mixed with ash and smoke, making the sky feel close enough to touch. The camp moved as it always had. But one morning the prisoners woke to find that Commander Falken was gone. No explanation, no ceremony, no reassignment announcement. His office was empty. His boots remained near the door. His coat hung neatly on its peg. His desk drawers were undisturbed, as if he had stood up in the middle of a thought and simply walked out into the snow and disappeared. Whispers spread, not among the prisoners who had learned the lethal price of curiosity, but among the guards. Some said he had been reassigned to the Eastern Front. Some said Berlin had recalled him for disciplinary review. Some said he had taken a pistol to the forest beyond the fences. Some said Kruger had written a report. Some said nothing at all. Weiss did not react, because reaction would require a self to react with. It was not until months later, after transport shifted, after the war began to turn, after the chimneys burned hotter than ever, that something happened which did not belong to the machinery of the camp. A letter came, not addressed to the commandant, not to the doctor, not to an officer, to a prisoner. A letter with no return address, smuggled, carried hand to hand, hidden beneath clothing, risked by people whose names would never be recorded. It was placed into Weiss's hand at dusk, when the guards were distracted, when the barracks exhaled slow and tired breath. He did not open it immediately. His fingers hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the fragile terror that comes when memory threatens to return. When he finally unfolded the paper, thin, creased, worn from travel, the handwriting struck him first, small, careful, not a child's hand, not quite a woman's, just a survivor's. It contained only one sentence: "You no esqueci você." I have not forgotten you. No name, no explanation, no promise of reunion, no hope, just the acknowledgement that something existed, however briefly, in a world built to destroy existence itself. Weiss closed the letter. He did not cry. Tears belonged to lives that had futures, but something shifted, barely, behind his eyes. Not enough to heal, not enough to revive, enough to prove the camp had not erased everything. Because memory, even when buried under ash, is a coal. It does not brighten. It waits for breath, for time, for a world that is no longer burning. And this was only one among thousands of stories swallowed by the silence of that war, stories buried in fields of unmarked earth, stories dissolved in smoke that drifted into the sky and settled on rooftops miles away, stories that history books simplify and newspapers forget. But you heard one. You remembered one. And remembrance is resistance. So if you understand what was lost here, if you feel the weight of what should never have been, then do what memory demands. Share this story. Speak it. Preserve it. Do not let it disappear. There are stories that end, And there are stories that continue even after every person who lived them has turned to ash. Stories that stay suspended in the air like smoke that refuses to disappear. Stories that do not ask to be remembered, they demand it. And this is one of them. Not because of grand heroism, not because of redemption or triumph, not because there is any light waiting at the end, but because what happened here was real, and the most horrifying truth of all is that what is real can be forgotten. You have reached the end of this story, but the world you live in is the same world that built the one we just walked through, the same world that applauds obedience, rewards silence, and turns its head when cruelty is convenient. And so the question is not what happened then, but what you will do now. If you close this video and let the silence swallow what you felt, then this story dies a second death, and that death is the one history never records, the one that happens quietly, invisibly, inside the chest of every person who chooses forgetfulness over memory. That is how atrocities vanish, not when they stop happening, but when they stop being told. When the last witness closes their eyes, when the last person who cared stops speaking, when the smoke dissolves into air and becomes too distant to matter. Do not let yourself become another step in that erasure. Do not let this dissolve inside you. Hold it, feel the weight, carry it forward. Leave a comment, not for me, not for numbers, not for engagement, but as a mark, a trace, a sign carved into the wall of the present that says, I saw this, I heard this. I will not allow it to disappear. Write your reaction, your silence, your discomfort, or even just one word, because sometimes one word is the only thing that keeps a memory from dying. Write it so that others who arrive here do not arrive alone. Stories like this are not shared. They are witnessed, and a witness who does not speak is indistinguishable from one who never existed. Subscribe, not to follow a channel, but to remain a witness. Because this was only one story buried under snow and smoke. There are others, thousands, millions, stories of children whose names were erased, of families burned without graves, of survivors who walked out into life but never walked back into themselves. Stories that history filed away under numbers and lists because it was easier than acknowledging the unbearable truth that these were people with hearts, memories, fears, dreams, hands that once held someone gently. To subscribe here is to say, continue. I am still listening. I am not afraid to see what the world tried to hide. And if there is someone, one person, who you believe needs to understand that cruelty is not distant, that history is not past, that silence is not neutral, then send this to them, not as entertainment, not as shock, but as a mirror, a reminder, a warning, because the world forgets fast, and forgetting is how it begins again. This was one story, but there are others waiting, buried under the same snow, breathing under the same ash. And if you are still here and still reading, still feeling something you cannot quite name, then you already know. We are not done. This is only the first grave we have uncovered together.